Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today's Tuesday, October 27th, 2020. So, what I'm going to be doing for the next several weeks, we're going to go back to the old format where every other broadcast will be a Q&A. That'll give me a chance to address new parents and any live questions that come in. If you want to check in about topics that I don't necessarily have on the docket. But what I'm going to be doing over the next several weeks, every other week besides the Q&A, is I'm going to be going through my book chapter by chapter and having a discussion about it. So for me, it could be helpful during this broadcast if you've read the Audacity to Be You. If you have questions about it, to send those in at any time, because that gives me an idea for those of you who have read it what I might be missing or what I could explain with a little bit more specificity. So this is a really easy broadcast for me to do, as all of these are. And this first chapter, in fact, I wrote the Audacity to Be You in a week because I had really had building up for some time leading up to that a really good idea about what I wanted to write about. Uh, but before I wrote really the bulk of the book, I wrote an introductory chapter, and that's what tonight's broadcast on it. In fact, it almost became the title of the book when I was considering titles. And the first chapter is called On Being Human. I know that might be generic, and that's why I didn't choose it for a title, but it really is the idea about what it means to be a human, what it means to be a person. Another title that I played with throughout my development was what it means to be a self and to love another. And you'll find that language in the book. Um, so let me launch right into it. Again, please feel free to ask questions about topics that might need further explanation or might be very nuanced. I love this quote that I recently found or somebody shared with me. The questioner asks the question, how are we to treat others? And the master answers, there are no others. I talk about, and I get this question a lot actually. Readers will write me emails and send me messages asking me about the main premise of the book, which is it is that our relationship with ourselves really forms the basis for our relationships with everybody else. And people ask about that all the time because, again, like a lot of our dialogue, a lot of what I write, it's very nuanced. And because tonight I'm going to be emphasizing a change in levels of consciousness. That's a really important idea, that we're really moving up into a different way of talking and thinking about things. There's a quote by Joseph Campbell, who, if you follow my work, you know I love his work so much, and I'll be quoting him and talking about him a little bit later tonight. Joseph Campbell says, "In one way or another, all religions are true." Sigmund Freud at one point said, "We tell the story of the stork delivering a baby to a family, and because we are such literal people, we lose touch with the spiritual or metaphorical realm where the stork signifies this dramatic change that just appears in our lives one day." And so in a very real sense, Freud's talking about how that analogy is true. It's just that we're operating on a lower level of consciousness, on a more literal, or maybe you might have heard the word when speaking about religion, a more fundamental level, where everything is taken very, very literal. So tonight, we're really going to be talking about, if you're joining me, please don't change my slides. We have a little bit of a glitch with folks joining me as presenters, so welcome my co-presenters. If tonight we're going to be talking about this kind of higher level of consciousness, what it means to understand things at a different level. I've shared this quote from Einstein recently over the past few weeks because it really hit me. Although I had read it before, I just didn't realize how beautiful and profound it was in its simplicity. And Einstein said, and there's a few variations because I imagine he spoke it originally in German, but essentially what he says is no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. So what he's saying and what Campbell is talking about and Freud and I am talking about is that we have to think about it differently. And that's why when you come to Evoke, when you come to this work, and you ask questions like, what should I do? We are basically, in all reality, unable to answer that question. It's not a technique. It's not a gimmick. When I say I don't know what you should do, I really mean it. And really what therapy becomes if we allow ourselves, if we allow it to take hold of us, is I think effective therapy eventually raises our level of consciousness. And you already know what I'm talking about. You already know what that's like with, for those of you who have been on this journey a little while, where friends are having discussions, for example, around and about success in ways that you used to agree with the definition or the standards of success, where now you don't see and agree with them. Ideas that you had about what it means to be a good friend, a good parent, a good child, a good sister, a good brother. You now understand a different way of thinking about that. So part of the invitation of this book, this work, is to raise your level of consciousness. In the foreword of my book, Dr. Jamie Gill writes, "We ask people for advice. They tell us the same things, though each piece of advice is maddeningly different from the next. All this advice, and we still don't know what to do. We are like people listening to a jukebox that only has one tune. We have played it a million times, but it still sounds the same." And what JD is talking about, again, is this idea that, when I'm working with a family or a couple or an individual, really anybody, I've said this before. We'll have a discussion, and probably some of you have this experience. I've had it on the receiving end, where some idea, some circumstance, some situation where I have a big question surrounding this circumstance gets answered, or at least I feel that it gets answered. And I have a confidence and a clarity and moving forward, kind of my path moving forward. And then I or my client goes out into the world. They get on the phone with their child or with their spouse or whomever is involved in the circumstance, and they get confused. They get pushed off their center. They started off the conversation grounded, but they become quickly ungrounded. And they'll come back to me and they'll say things like, I thought I knew what we were talking about, but then my daughter said this. Or I thought I knew what I was going to do, the position I was going to take, but then my spouse or my ex-spouse, my co-parent said this. And what they're sharing with me is that the idea or the thinking, not the idea, the thinking is not completely formed in them. So many people will say to me after working with me for a long time, and this is the same thing I say about my therapist. They'll say, in a given situation or question that arises in my life, I think to myself, what would Brad say? What would Brad do in this circumstance? And don't worry, that doesn't give me a big ego. I do the same thing. I'm stealing from my mentors and therapists also ideas or ways of thinking. I do that with Jamie Gill all the time. And what people are saying is they wonder if they can apply the thinking to the new situation. So as you immerse yourself in these podcasts, these webinars, as you immerse yourself in the books, the curriculum of Evoke therapy programs, our goal, my idea is that you develop a new sensibility, a new way of thinking. And I use that word sensibility. And what I mean by that is what it means to be a person and be in the world with other people. And the idea is so fundamental. It's not a technique or a skill or a concept or even idea. It's such a fundamental way of being that the only way that we can describe it is by metaphor, by symbol, by storytelling. So I'll tell a story to a client. I'll say, well, for example, if I were in this situation, I might look at it this way. I'm not giving advice or giving the answer. I'm saying, this is how I would think about it. And when I'm coaching parents or coaching somebody in their life, some people ask for coaching. When I'm coaching people, still in that role, I'm not giving them guidelines going forward about what they need to do. I'm trying to teach them how to think. I've had so many clients over the years, and this might be as much of a testament to this idea as anything, who have said to me after working for a long time on themselves and being quite open with their social group or their work group or maybe their family and extended family about the work or the struggle that they've been going through. Somebody will come up to them after a crisis arises in their life and say to my client, what do I do? What have you learned? What would you do in the situation? And clients will often say, they'll tell me, I don't know what to say to them. I'll just tell them therapy works, or this book helped, or this podcast helped. And really what they're saying is, I don't know how to explain to you what it is because it's so comprehensive. It's such a different way of being. It's why when clients tell me, in fact, one of you told me, one of you that's on this list right now, some time ago when we were just checking in with each other, you were telling me that you were trying to find your people, your tribe. And what you're saying is you want to find people that are operating at this level of consciousness, that aren't talking about financial success as the sole measure of success, or that aren't talking about a child attending an Ivy League level school as the measure of a child's success, and maybe even more principally their worth. Where you want to talk to people who realize that a mother's, or father's for that matter, worth, that their report card is not based on how the child is doing, but rather how the parent is doing. So we're all kind of looking for that level of consciousness. When you all say to me, and many of you do when I'm visiting, you say, especially early on, I don't get it. And what I say back to you is just keep coming, keep trying. In fact, I'm looking at the list and I've heard some of you say that, and you kept coming and you kept listening, and now it makes sense to you. And you come back, I suspect, and you can write to me and tell me if it's different. You come back to be reminded, to be reintroduced and re-immersed into this way of thinking. Even if you've attended an intensive, or if you've gone through the process at Evoke as a parent of a child in a wilderness program, and you've really had a really good and robust kind of change of course, it's easy to go back to the mother tongue. We learned in sports psychology that under stress or anxiety, we resort back to what is most comfortable. So if you learn a new skill, new idea, even a new way, like I'm describing tonight, and you're presented with something that's frightening or upregulating, which means that your nervous system is upregulated, is on edge, is in fight or flight mode, that it is tempting for all of us to resort or regress back to earlier, more primitive ways of coping. We're about to enter the holiday season, right? The November and the December holidays. And although COVID, the pandemic, is going to affect family gatherings, I imagine for many of us, some of us will be getting together with extended family. Some of you will. Hopefully you'll do that as safely as possible, of course. But if you're getting together with family, you'll recognize regression, right? Being in the presence of your family of origin, you will feel like a 16-year-old again. Assuming, by the way, you're not a 16-year-old listening to this. You'll feel like a 12-year-old. You might feel even younger. Your spouse will often look at you and your reactions to your family of origin and say, who is this person? This immature person that I don't recognize. And what you can say to them is, this is my wounded, stuck teenager, pre-adolescent self that comes out around my family of origin. So in our way of thinking, in my way of thinking, and Evoke's way of thinking, we're not going to provide you with advice to a large extent, with directions or guidelines about where you need to go, but we're going to teach you, like I talk about in the first book, teach you how to become an expert on yourself, so then you can go forward. And so when circumstances change, because you've internalized the way of being, the concepts, the pattern of thinking, you know how to adjust the things along the way. I remember many years ago, I was riding up a chairlift. It was at Sundance, or excuse me, not at Sundance. It was at Snowbird, Utah, one of one of the premier ski resorts in North America. And I remember I saw a very advanced skier take off from a mogul and fly 20, 25 feet in the air and land. And I'm watching this with awe and respect. And I was thinking to myself, I doubt that this person, this individual, memorized the bumps, memorized the terrain so much. I think it was a he that he was able to jump and kind of plan his landing. I imagine that he's such an advanced skier that he can take off and it doesn't matter what the landing area looks like. He can stick it. Right? He can land it because he knows all that's involved at a very cellular level, right? At a very body level, he knows how to ski at an advanced level, and so he can stick it no matter what. I thought about this quote from the forward of the book, just to again to launch us into a chapter that's really going to launch us into the rest of the chapters that we go over the next several weeks. Also from J.D. Gill, and for those of you who don't know, J.D. Gill, uh, that's her author name. Her the name that she goes by is Jamie. So you'll hear me interchange those names. And she's my therapist and has been my therapist and my wife's therapist since 1998. Just this amazing woman. There's a podcast and a YouTube video where I talk to her if you want to learn about her. And she's written, I think, 20 books or so, somewhere in that range. She's quite amazing, and she agreed to write the forward to my book. And Jamie wrote this. She said, "What does a well-trained therapist look like?" Think about this, by the way. This can be a reference point for all of you as you go out in the world and choose a therapist, but also to some extent choose your friends or your people, right? Who are the people that you're going to spend time with? She says, "What does a well-trained therapist look like? A well-trained therapist is an expert at listening. He or she wants to hear how you feel, not how you are supposed to feel. He or she will try to find you where you are. He or she will try to find how it feels to be you with your history, your dilemmas, your hopes and fears. If instead of trying to hear you and find you, your therapist has the right answer for you, find another therapist. The right answer will be the therapist's answer and not your answer. And this process that JD is describing will likely duplicate the ways you were treated by your parents. Some of you might remember the story I've told a handful of times where I was driving, this is before COVID, driving my 12-year-old, she was 11 at the time, to therapy, and she said, "I don't know what to talk about today." And I said, I can't possibly imagine what you might talk about. I have no idea what you'll talk about. But I said, but I do have one thought, and that is that if your therapist starts to give you advice, if you're struggling and your therapist starts to give you advice, you can tell your therapist, "I don't need advice. I have parents for that." And I meant that humorously because we parents fall into this. We were just doing a staff training today, and the subject in our staff training, we have a weekly training every Tuesday for the staff coming into the field for their 8-day shift. And Judith Sedora, who is an expert in transracial adoption, was teaching our staff about transracial adoption. And she was saying, you know, when a black child is adopted by a white family, it could be, and many people's idea of that could be to say to the child, "You must be grateful, you must be happy. Great, you were adopted by this wonderful family." And then she went on to teach about how we should hold space and take a step back and not imagine what somebody's feeling or projecting that onto them, but really get curious and ask questions. After that discussion went on for a while, she said to all of us, "How does this apply to all of our clients? Whether they're black or transracially adopted or adopted at all, how does it relate?" And I listened and I said to our staff today, I said, "It would never occur to me, unless you're my child, of course, but it would never occur to me if you came to me telling me you had an experience or a situation to imagine I knew how it felt. I had a friend that was giving a talk recently, again on race. They both happen to be race, and he was describing his reaction to a black friend and how they reacted to a certain set of circumstances. And he came with this bias and that idea, and my thought was that happens all the time for all of us. You know, we people come to us with saying, I'm having a hard time exercising, right? I'm having a hard time with my child, my spouse. And the people in our lives who care about us, who haven't done this work that you're doing, will hear, well, that's a question. And if I'm going to be a good parent, a good friend, maybe even a good therapist, I'm going to have an answer for them. But the real gift, the master therapist leans into not knowing. I have no idea how you deal with that. That sounds really hard. Thanks for sharing that with me. I wish I could be helpful. Maybe, just maybe, I can share with you a circumstance that's similar that worked for me, but I have no idea if it's going to work for you. For those of you who have attended Al-Anon or 12-step meetings, you'll recognize that kind of language because the format, the structure in those 12-step meetings is no crosstalk, which means don't talk to other members during the group process. You get up and you share and you talk about yourself. And you'll hear people say, this is what worked for me in this circumstance. I've noticed, and I haven't heard this in a few years, but for years and years and years, as we were so strongly endorsing the idea that parents go to 12-step meetings, parents would come back and they would say, well, I went to an Al-Anon meeting or I went to a CODA meeting and everybody there was talking about an alcoholic spouse or everybody there was talking about a child who used substances. And so I couldn't relate. And of course, while the specifics are different, there is a fundamental underlying process that is similar to the way that Judith was teaching today. There's something unique about being a transracially adopted child in the United States of America today. And there are ideas, ways of thinking, and interacting that apply to that situation if you're going to be a helper, that apply to every situation. So the idea with this book was, again, I don't, more emphatically, even down to the title, I don't want to write another parenting book. Not because I'm not passionate about it, but because I don't want people to be confused and think that when I'm talking about parenting, that I'm talking about parenting. Because I'm really talking about you. An acquaintance of mine who read my first book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, who doesn't have a child and has never had a child, and he's in his 50s, said, I read it just because you wrote it, and I was curious. I think I gave it to him for free too. But he said, I couldn't believe how much it impacted all of my life, even though I've never, nor will I ever have children. I think I've told you at one point when I was doing my book tour for my first book, I was in New York and somebody said to me, so just tell me about the book. Give it to me, a synopsis. And I said, well, it's really not about parenting. It's really about you. And they looked at me kind of strange. I said, I might be too dramatic. The stories are about parenting. The examples are from parenting. But the fundamental struggles are the struggles of being a human being. And they have application to all of our life, all of our circumstances. So my energy about this book is I want to write something that shows, explains, illuminates the idea that all of this is just about the dilemma of being alive and relating to other people. So I wanted to write a book to everybody, and a book for those that the most common question I get asked in therapy starts off with, what should I do in XYZ circumstances? And again, my clients that have me for a while learn after a while, I know you're not going to answer that, but would you please answer that or give me an idea? I really wanted to dive into some ideas about kind of what it meant to be a human being. And then from there, kind of connect the dots with for everybody and help understand what the implications were. When I went to my first intensive as a participant 10 years ago, and I wrote about this in the first chapter of The Journey of the Heroic Parent, when I went, I didn't have my question solved. And I write about this in this chapter, right? I went there questioning my marriage, and nobody gave me advice about my marriage. But what happened was I spent 5 days diving deeply into my family of origin, and not just my family of origin. For those of you who are considering an intensive, I'll share with you. I spent 5 days diving into my peer group's family of origin, listening to their stories, their patterns, the ideas, the scripts, the roles over and over again. And after a while watching somebody, you develop a certain kind of clarity. So when it came time in the last 2 days to ask questions that we wanted to ask about our present day life, because that's what how the week was split up, I wasn't confused. I was clear as could be. I just realized I was afraid. I was afraid that if I spoke the truth and said what I wanted, that I would end up alone, rejected, sad, hurt. So I realized I have to tell the truth. And I was not conditioned as a child to tell the truth. I was conditioned, like most human beings, in fact, to sense what others wanted and to give that to them. And that gave me a sense of peace and well-being. That gave me the sense that I was safe, because then I wasn't going to be alone, because people were going to, my mother and father would want to be around me. So when I realized what was at play, that I was afraid to tell the truth, and really realizing I'll be okay, right? I might, some people are going to leave. Other people are going to show up. But the more that I can tell the truth, the more I end up surrounded by people who support me. So I didn't say this in the first book as explicitly, and I shared it with you in this chapter of the second book. I walked away and I said to my wife, here's what I want and don't want in a moment to moment basis. And I got to tell you, it was an adjustment for both of us. And initially, it was not met with encouragement and support and understanding. It was met with frustration and confusion and anxiety. But I kept my project in mind. I have to tell the truth. I have to learn to tell the truth about what I feel, what I think, what I want, what I believe. And it's terrifying. And I'm going to have to do it scared. And I know where that fear comes from, right? I could trace it back to my family of origin and how I needed to be to feel safe, to earn that belonging that all children need to feel safe. So I found a deeper version of myself, a more authentic, maybe more accurate version of myself. And from that place, I knew what to do, to tell the truth in a given moment. What happened was I lost friends, a lot of them. I thought, frankly, if I had made a bet, if you had asked me to place a bet, I thought I was going to lose my wife. I didn't walk out of that intensive saying, I want to stay married or I want to stay divorced. I said, right now, I don't know. And right now, I need to be by myself. And I don't know when I'm going to know. But that's my truth for today. And you know what my wife did is she did the work that's required to be able to hold me with patience and compassion and understanding. And so after a while, I started telling the truth more often. She got better at listening. See, I was always good at listening, and she was always good at telling the truth. There's usually one person who's a good truth teller and one who's a good listener, but they're not good at the other project. So I started developing the ability to tell the truth more often, and she started developing the ability to listen more. And then after a while, I realized I never want to leave this woman as long as I live. If I get to be me, and see, I didn't even have an idea that I could be me. I wasn't even thinking about that. I thought love was taking care of her because that's what I had learned from my mother growing up. I didn't realize that what starts with love is taking care of me. I read a quote today on social media where somebody says, if if we get together, if we form a couple, I don't want to be your first priority. I want you to be your first priority. I don't want to be a distraction from you doing what you need to do to be okay. So all of a sudden, the world just shifted on its axis just a little bit and everything made sense. I said I lost people. I said I was expecting to lose my wife, and ultimately I didn't. And we're married to this day, and we have a much better, what we call marriage 2.0. It's not perfect or flawless, and we still struggle at times, but we get the project in front of us, each of us. But I also found new friends. I found new people who didn't suppose that they knew my truth, who don't give me advice or answers, but listen, ask questions, and understand. So it's about deeper concepts. Um, the first wilderness, or excuse me, the first book, my first book was Wilderness Born, meaning it came out of my work in wilderness. And the second book was Intensives Born, right? The stories and examples came out of my work at intensives. Of course, they overlap by about 90% of the content overlaps, but the stories and the examples are different. I also thought with my second book, I can be a little bit more bold and I'm less afraid. I'm less afraid to tell the truth about what I know. See, I'd been taught that my pseudo confidence growing up was arrogance and unattractive. I've always kind of been a very loud presence in my life. And that comes from a variety of places, including, of course, insecurity at times. So I was afraid to claim what I knew. But after doing this work longer, I realized I don't have to be afraid, and people don't have to like it. They don't have to agree with any of this. I think about inner child work. So this book become the template or the pattern for all of the relationships. So I think this can kind of help us understand it. This is what I wrote. Inner child work is where you imagine your young self as a third person, in the third person. It is as if you could travel back in time and sit with your younger self. You imagine talking to your young self and listening to what they are feeling and thinking. You hear their fears, their hurt, their shame. You can also listen to them, welcome their story, and offer your patience and presence. It's so clear to me when I'm working with people and we're talking about other people in their lives during the therapy session, that the problem that they have with their husband's arrogance comes from what they were taught about what it meant to be a person. The problem that they have with their child's impulsivity or disrespect. The idea about that comes from the context that they grew up on about what it meant to be a child. And so really, when I see you deal with your wounds, think of something that you do that's a pattern that you don't like about yourself, that you get frustrated with yourself and get angry at yourself, maybe even feel shame about. When I watch a client or a person struggle with that, I know how they're going to respond to somebody else who has a similar kind of struggle. And here's the interesting thing about this inner child work. I've learned this from my intensive work and doing so many guided therapy sessions using this idea of the inner child as a third person, as a separate entity, kind of enrolling somebody else and talking to them. The inner child doesn't need advice and doesn't even need reassurance in many cases, although that's closer to what they need. The inner child needs to be heard and understood. You need to be heard and understood. I need to be heard and understood. And when I'm heard and understood, or you're heard and understood, or your child or your spouse is heard and understood, you'll see their shoulders drop. You'll see their breathing slow down. You'll watch their chest relax. They'll ease into their seat. And what you're seeing is the nervous system relax because it's not feeling threatened or attacked. Folks, I can't overstate what I'm about to say. There's so much gaslighting going on in this world. It's happening all the time. Some people don't like when I say that because they associate gaslighting with really severe malignant narcissist or sociopath. But when I use gaslighting, I'm talking about the idea that people telling us how we should feel, what we should want, what kind of food we should try. There's so much gaslighting going on. You'll know you're with your people when you share dilemmas, questions, challenges, crises, and circumstances, and they just listen and offer support. And they're not inclined to lead off with advice. And then when the nervous system is relaxed, that's a signal that the person is open to some new information, an idea, a thought. Borrowing from my broadcast on the 8 tools, changing from advice to phrases like I have a thought or I have an idea or this is what's worked for me. You see how non-threatening those things are. Even with children, I have a goal. I have an aspiration. And this aspiration is that I aspire to not knowing what my children should do, to not knowing what their path should be. That's my aspiration. And when new clients or new listeners or new readers hear me say that, that doesn't go well. They're usually really reactive and confused by that. And they'll say things like, but isn't that the role of a parent? And my answer is, I don't think so. And by the way, fairly early on, your children know all of your lectures, all of your shoulds. And I know they know that because I watch young people give each other shoulds all the time in areas and in circumstances and situations that they themselves have not resolved. I watch adults give each other shoulds all the time. See, shoulds, that's not the thing in life. And my experience is after you do this work and you've gotten to this new level of consciousness, you just won't use the word should. It won't make any sense to you anymore. Now I want to talk about this chapter. I've talked about this book. I want to talk about this chapter because when I wrote this and kind of outlined it in my head before I sat down, I thought, okay, what's chapter 1? And chapter 1 is on, what it means to be a human being and a self. That's the first, that ended up being the introduction chapter that we're talking about tonight, and chapter 1 about finding you. And because I took it for granted, I take it for granted sometimes in my life, that being me is the goal. I've told the story where my children were extra sensitive about my 2 older children were extra sensitive about their mother's circumstances around the holidays because she was alone. She'd just gone through a divorce with their stepfather. And so I was feeling conflicted and torn. Like maybe I should invite her over for Christmas. We're friendly, but we're not friends. I thought, wow, if I could invite her over for the holidays, then it would be great for my children because they wouldn't have to feel that conflict, and it'd be great for my ex-wife, who's a nice person and I care about her. But it would take a little bit away from my holiday because I can't completely relax. I don't feel comfortable completely being me. So I was struck with this dilemma and not knowing a way out. So I shared this with my therapist, and I don't usually use the word should. It's not natural for me to use that word. But I found myself struggling, and then I knew I was in a really stuck place when I couldn't form a question to Jamie without the word should in it. But eventually I was able to utter something like, what would be, in your opinion, the most ideal thing? And she said, I think the ideal thing is that you're yourself. You're you. And I remember thinking, I forgot that that's my job. That's my number one job is to be me. And that's not an invitation to disregard other people, not care about other people, and be hedonistic and lawless and an anarchist in relationship. It just means I do what I can and I don't do what I can't. See, my tendency would be to do the right thing, right? Some of you relate to that. My tendency would try to do to try to do the right thing, but not really sort out what I need. And that process is at the core of every significant problem that I've ever gotten into in my entire life. I end up resentful, angry, starving for what I need because I'm not feeding myself, and then taking in stuff, food, whatever it is, to fill that hole because I'm not feeding myself. Instead, Jamie's invitation was, if you can do it and you're okay, do it. If you can't, you don't have to. So I didn't do it that first year. This is a few years ago. By the way, the next year I did for Thanksgiving. And it went so well, she came back for Christmas, and that's happened ever since. And I look forward to spending Christmas with all of my children, my wife, and my ex-wife this year. I wanted to borrow this from the Four Agreements. I'm going to borrow a few slides, a few quotes from the Four Agreements, because I think Don Miguel Ruiz does a fantastic job of talking about the importance of the foundation of self and how it predicts and sets the pattern for all relationships. He says, it is important that to me that what you think about me, excuse me, it is not important to me what you think about me. And I don't take what you think personally. I don't take it personally when people say, Miguel, you are the best. And I also don't take it personally when they say, Miguel, you are the worst. Nothing other people do, he goes on to say, is because of you. It's because of themselves. All people live in their own dream, in their own mind. They are in a completely different world from the one that we live in. When we take something personally, we make the assumption that they know what is in our world, and we try to impose our world and their world. You might even tell me, he goes on to say, Miguel, what are you saying? What you're saying is hurting me. But it is not what I am saying that is hurting you. It is that you have wounds that I touch by what I have said. You are hurting yourself. The idea here is that we become responsible agents for our lives. I forgot to put this quote up there, but I was thinking about this when I was creating these slides earlier today. A woman, Connie Zweig, who wrote a couple of books that I really love, she spent years of her life seeking for enlightenment. She went to India and looked for gurus and therapists and did all kinds of incredible, made all kinds of incredible efforts to seek and achieve enlightenment. And she says at one point, and I don't know what the impetus was for this, but she said at one point, it occurred to me for the first time in my life that my unhappiness came from the way that I was living my life. And that had never occurred to me before. Imagine this idea. What if your unhappiness around your child's circumstances was about you? What if your unhappiness in your marriage was about you? What if your unhappiness or lack of serenity or lack of peace was about you and the way that you were living your life? I'm not saying that I'm a father. I'm not saying that if somebody in my family was hurt, that it wouldn't hurt. that if they struggle, that I don't feel something. But what we're talking about is a more fundamental, a more transcendent sense of peace and okayness. See, people lose people to death. Some of you have lost people that you love to death. Some of you have lost parents, siblings, friends. Hopefully none of you have lost children, but I've worked with many many parents who have lost children over the years. It's a real thing that happens. And essentially, that can't be prevented unless, of course, you yourself die very young. You're going to lose people. So there will be pain and grief and sadness. But what the therapists and the teachers are trying to teach us is that the transcendent, fundamental sense of peace is your responsibility. And that what other people think about you is none of your business. Do you know why we don't know what Don Miguel Ruiz teaches in the second agreement? Not to take anything personally, is because we were conditioned by our parents and they were conditioned by theirs to believe that when mom and dad were happy, we were doing something right. And when mom and dad were upset, we were doing something wrong. Not only were we conditioned to believe that, but they told us that. So we turn around and tell our children. My anger, my sadness, my worry is supposed to indicate to you. It's supposed to tell you that you're on the wrong path. And my feeling proud or happy about and for you are supposed to tell you that you're on the right path. And while that might seem harmless and probably is the most universal idea in parenting that most parents that I meet anywhere in the world that I meet them have, it's insane. For example, the real example, my mother belongs to a religious sect, right? Denomination. She has a belief system and goes to church on the weekend. And it would be best for her if I joined that church and believed what she believed. She's sad about it. I get letters once in a while about it. She tells me that she prays for me. I have no plans to join her church. It has no impact on me. I'm not tempted to join her church, to believe what she believes. She's voting for a different candidate than I am for the presidential election in 7 days. That's irrelevant to me. It's a different value system. It's a different way of looking and thinking about the world. So we were conditioned, and we condition our children to believe that what other people think and feel and how they react is about them. That's our primary, folks, that's our primary fuel for motivation for our children. That's what we hand them. And then we wonder why people end up so messed up. The goal of therapy, according to Sigmund Freud, and he knew something about therapy, the goal of therapy is freedom. Essentially, freedom from unconscious obligations. Freedom from thinking that you have to be, think, feel, or do something for somebody else. And where do we learn that? In childhood. And how was it communicated to us? It was communicated to us in a million different ways. Another quote from Don Miguel Ruiz, just to emphasize it. I have a couple more. I thought I was done with him, but here's what else he said. He said, you can ask for what you need. You can say yes or you can say no, whatever you choose, without guilt or self-judgment. You can choose to follow your heart always. Then you can be in the middle of hell and still experience inner peace and happiness. You can stay in your state of bliss and hell will not affect you at all. He's pretty dramatic, right? That's an ideal that he's setting out there for us. So I wrote this first chapter because you and yourself are the start, the foundation. I spend so much time. In fact, this hit me actually as I was preparing to write the book. I was in New York. This hit me when I was speaking to a group of parents and I was talking about listening and understanding children and being curious and being patient. And two mothers in the group almost simultaneously said some version of, "So you think we should just be a doormat?" And then I realized I had skipped over an assumption that I'm, of course, like I said earlier, that I'm prone to skip over in my own life. And I said, "No, I'm sorry. Let me back up and then we'll get to the child thing. You get to be you. You get to have a limited, finite amount of energy and patience and love and care and all of that because you're human. And you get to have boundaries because of that finite. You're not God. Pick your higher power. You're not God. You're human. And because of that, you're going to have limitations. And the child will inevitably discover those. And so you get to have them. You get to say, this is enough. This is what I need. Your room has to be clean. This is the chore that you have to do before you get the reward. You get to have your boundaries. And then on that foundation, which must be accounted for. I was going to say must be built, but you don't have to build it. You can not build your foundation. But you all know what would happen if you just plopped down a house without a foundation. It would eventually sink and get uneven and crack and fall apart. So you built this foundation first of self, and then you build the rest of your life on top of it and all of your relationships. What others think about me is none of my business. A slogan that I love from Al-Anon. And by the way, when I meet with your children, when I'm out in the field visiting the various groups, I don't meet with all of them, but when I do, I share this with them. I say, it's not your job to make your parents proud. What they think about you is none of your business. This is about, I tell the children, your mental health, your life, your path. Yes, they care about you. And sure, some of the ideas they have, I think, are pretty decent ideas. But this is about you. And if we are going to suggest that you just need to line up with what your parents think, how are you going to find out who you are? You won't. You can't. That's not how self works. It's kind of messy. I wrote this in this first chapter. Joseph Campbell, a foremost American expert in mythology, explained that the purpose of the heroic journey illustrated in our myths is to describe a transformation of consciousness. You recognize that term, transformation of consciousness? It's like what Einstein was saying. The kind of change he is talking about is more than a new skill or tool can provide. The shift is fundamental. It's a different way of being. This transformation is even beyond explanation. That's what this is about. That's what this book is about. That's what this work is about. I think that's what differentiates Evoke therapy programs from many of the other therapy programs for children and family out there. Is that we're not going to provide you a formula that you can manualize. And if you follow, you'll have success. We're gonna help you, support you to go where you need to go, and your children too, to be you, to be a self. Going on, I write, it's difficult to put into words or to explain to another person, which is why it is often illustrated through stories or examples. The story in Campbell's work, it's the myth. The story shows us how it would look and sound if we experienced this change. The lessons in these stories, the lessons from the prophets, are vertical rather than horizontal. That is, the prophets see different levels or layers of life. They don't offer us necessarily a history lesson or a glimpse into the future. They provide us with a deeper meaning to our lives. That's what the great thinkers and the prophets do. They offer us a glimpse into this higher level of consciousness, and they use stories to do it. because you could spend the rest of your life trying to explain this stuff through explanation and would never stop talking because circumstances are always growing and changing. The story, if you have a higher power, in Campbell's way of thinking, the higher power is the kind of the penultimate example of what it means to be transformed. None of us can really understand perfection, omnipotence, right? We can't really understand that. We can imagine ideas and thoughts and we can read stories about it, but we can't really imagine it. It's beyond our ability. But the idea of God is an idea that illustrates this different level, this different way of looking at the world. Banksy, the enigmatic graffiti artist, illustrated this depth of training on becoming a human. He said, a lot of parents will do anything for their kids except for let them be themselves. In the first book, I said, when you say that you have faith that your child is going to turn out okay, what that means is you're signing up for, in most cases, they're going to turn out entirely differently than you could have ever imagined. Part of, and this isn't all of it, but part of what our parents are telling us, excuse me, what our children are telling us, part of what our children are telling us is, I want to break out of your context. Your context is too small. The ideas about life that you have are too small for me, too limited. And it's messy. And they do really dumb and dangerous things. But they're asking in ways that they don't even know that they're asking and can't even articulate. They're asking you to stretch. You end up on a webinar or on a podcast app listening to me, right? That's what happened. And you're learning about a new way to be. And the premise of our getting together, you and I, for some of you, the premise of our getting together is I'm here to teach you how to be a better parent to fix your kid. That's the premise. That's the ticket that gets you entry into all of this. But you stay around a little and you realize that there's something else going on here. And that's what this book and this chapter is trying to introduce you to. I mentioned this earlier. When clients, children, or others are understood, instead of being seen as something that needs to be fixed, they relax, see themselves and their wounds more clearly, and begin to heal. I often hear parents say, you need to be a parent to your child, not their friend. That's a pretty common adage in our culture. But I thought about this for a long time. This idea that you should be your child's parent, not their friend, may miss the fact that many of the same qualities that exist in a healthy friendship will exist in a healthy relationship. Boundaries, a strong and clear sense of oneself, assertive communication, authentic presence, and love. I believe the reason many people misunderstand the similarities between relationships, friendship, couples, and children is because many people misunderstand the core elements of a healthy relationship of any kind. There's no shame here. It's just that we had no training. They didn't know. It just shows us how little we have been exposed to healthy models. I know what people mean when they say you should be your child's parent. They're saying make tough decisions, and they're encouraging parents not to let the child's feelings toward the parent dictate the parent's behavior and their boundaries. That's what they're trying to suggest, because many parents are susceptible to that, right? I've said this before, but it's just amazing to me that it's the same parents. It's us. It's us, same parents. You know, there's that adage that I've shared with you that previous generations of children worried what their parents thought about them. And today, It's more common to hear a critique that parents worry about what children think about them. And my point is, it's the same person doing the worrying. The child who believed that the parents' feelings and thoughts about them were evidence of their goodness or worthiness grew up without a self. And so they look to their children to give them something that they should have gotten from their parents. So I started writing this when I was signing books for my first book, and it became a line in this book. No matter the story, no matter the specifics, the heroic journey is always inward. And the stories and myths we have about heroic adventures, at least in Joseph Campbell's way of thinking, my way of thinking, they're all metaphors for the journey inward, for looking in here. If you have the courage to face your fear and to show up to an intensive, to go to therapy, to walk into a 12-step meeting, to even listen to the podcast and start to consider how you might be the problem in your life, you have embarked on the hero's journey. If you relegate yourself to the company of those who believe that you're only as happy as your least happy child, or your ex-spouse was a narcissist or a borderline, and that's the reason it went poorly, you're not on the heroic journey. So the work is to look inward, to look for a new level of consciousness. Find mentors and your people. Surround yourself with this kind of thinking, and then learn to think about the problems. I'll take 2 questions, Malia, and then we'll save the rest of them for Thursday night. Okay? Someone says, how can you focus on what your kids need without placating your wife and when you are in a co-parenting situation? Well, that's a very difficult situation. I found that I was spending a lot of times parenting my children to make my wife happy. So I had to get out of that. And I got out of it my way. But you're right. It's hard. We make sometimes decisions that we're really not, in this example, we're really not taking care of the child. We're taking care of our spouse's anxiety or frustration and anger, and really getting them off our back. So it's a lot of work. I've done a podcast on co-parenting. And later on in this series that I'm going to be doing, when we get to the chapters on love and on marriage, maybe we can talk about that some more. It's a complex process, difficult process. And it is a challenge. It's hard to take care of 2 people at the same time when their needs are conflicting, for sure. So the answer is, you know what the answer to all these questions is? Do your work. Do your work. Your work will give you your answers. I'll use this last example, and I'm going to say this probably in this series many times. So this is a simple example, and I'm just going to use divorce and marriage as the metaphor. Divorce is not the answer to your problems, period. Staying married is not the answer to your problems, period. The answer is inside. What do you need? What can you do? What are you okay with? Who are you? What's your relationship to your spouse? What's your relationship to their issues? Out of that critical self-exploration comes the answer to staying married or divorced. And I, ethically, can't advise you to get divorced or not. What I can help you to do, if you're making a decision with your child or with your spouse or changing careers or whatever it is, what I can do is I can provide you a place to find yourself. And out of that discovery comes the truth, comes the decision about what you're going to do with your life. Just like with my example at the beginning of tonight, I did not ask questions or get advice about my marriage. I discovered that I'd spent my life lying about who I was, what I felt, what I thought, what I believed at an unconscious level to try to make other people happy, to try to ensure my place. And so I told the truth and I risked losing my wife. And I have an amazing, strong, courageous wife who did her work enough that she stuck around. Someone writes, sometimes I feel that your idea of being a person is more like being a super person. It's not a criticism. It's just the process of becoming adult is hard often. You're right. I'm basically telling you to become like God. That's a tiny challenge, isn't it? I will tell you this. Everything I talk and teach about, I struggle with. But talking about an ideal means that I'm establishing a project. When parents come to the intensive with their children, what the parent comes away with is a new idea about what the project is. They come in thinking they need to figure out what buttons to push in the child to motivate them or to get through to them or to get the child to talk, right? That's what they come with. Those don't sound like horrible things. But what they come away with is the realization that they're the ones that need help, that they're actually doing something that's contributing to the problem that they're complaining about. And so they walk away with hope, not because they become a super person, but because they know what the project is. I am not at peace in my life because I have arrived. I'm at peace in my life because I know where I'm going and I know what the project is. And I know when I lose focus or lose track of or take my eyes off the target, I know I can fix it. So thank you for that. All right, if you want to do a deep dive of this work, if you want to do the work where this book was born, we have online intensives and in-person intensives. I believe the November one is full with a waiting list, so December has just been put on the schedule. We have COVID testing and we have a COVID-safe environment. If you have questions about it, you can contact intensives@evoketherapy.com. If you want to save some time and money, and if you don't want to travel because of the pandemic, you can also do an intensive online. The next one that's available is November 13th. If you want to do a pursuit trip with your child, think of therapy light, kind of adventure activities, or you have an adult, if you're an adult or you have a young adult child, anywhere from 3 to 30-day programs all over the world. And we can do them COVID safe with COVID testing for the staff and anyone that you interact with. Our parent support groups are online right now. The next one is October 29th. So that actually is going to compete with my Q&A. So October 29th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time is our next one. And our Intensives Alumni Online Support Group is November 10th. Just contact Malia@evoketherapy.com for more information for the schedule. We ask all parents to go to 6 12-step support groups. Any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, adult children. Adult children is a perfect example of what I was teaching tonight. Adult children is short for adult children of alcoholics. So a lot of people would rule themselves out of that. But what it should be called, I just said this with a client who found a place in adult children, who doesn't have any alcoholism in his family. He said it should just be called adult children of parents, of human parents. So adultchildren.org, refugerecovery.org, or NAMI.org. All of those have sources and information and education in your area for free. These broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast. Please subscribe. Give us feedback there. Give us a rating. You can also go to soundcloud.com on your computer to find all of these. You can also go to YouTube to watch and listen to all of these. On Twitter and Instagram, you can find Evoke Therapy and Evoke Therapy Intensives. You can also find us on Facebook by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. The Evoke Family Foundation is at evokefamilyfoundation.org. That's an organization that helps people that can't afford therapy. And then, of course, the Evoke Therapy blog. My first book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, and The Audacity to Be You, my second book, are both available on Amazon. And yeah, that's all for tonight. Oh, upcoming webinars. I'm going to be talking to you Actually, I'm not talking the rest of this week. So the next one will be November 2nd. It'll be a Q&A. November 2nd, 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, a Q&A for Evoke friends and family. So I hope this is a helpful point of contact. If you don't know about our wilderness therapy program, please go to evoketherapy.com. If you're curious, thank you for joining me. I respect your showing up and listening this long because it means that you are taking the heroic journey to look at yourself. Thanks for joining me this evening. Take care, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.